That's definitely more minor. But if I put it in more of a major context, there you can hear it's more of a major, bright, happy kind of sound. So those two chords are equivalent. Moving on, we have the same ideas but in the key of F. And so if we had an F chord, that's the notes F, A, and C. Let's check it out. You have an A note, you have a C note, you have an F note, and you have another A note. It's doubled, F, A, and C. Well, when you play a D minor chord, that has the notes D, F, and A in it. We have an A note, a D note, an F note, and another A note. So there's two notes in common between the F chord and the D minor chord. And those two notes being F and A. Those are the two notes in common. In fact, to make a D minor chord, all you have to do is take your F chord and leave it as it is. Just add your third finger to the C string 2nd fret, the note D. We're changing the note C into the note D, raising it a whole step. So F and D minor are very, very similar. G and E minor are similar. So there's chord equivalence in essence. You know, you really see it easily because of the number of fingers you have to move to make one chord go to the other. They're so related, they're so equivalent that it only takes one little move to change from one to the other. And then the sound, of course, you can hear that those two chords sound similar. A little different, but they're related and have quite a bit in common. Alright, so that would be how to take what we talked about in the key of C and flip it over to the key of F. You can do that for any key. The key of G has the same equivalents, just with different letter names, different pitch levels. Alright, let's get into those diminished chords I was talking about earlier. A B diminished chord has the notes B, D, and F in it. Well, a G7 chord has G, B, and D in it. They have two notes in common. They have the notes B and D in common. So G7 and B diminished are very compatible, very much interchangeable. You could use either one in a song and it would sound correct. So diminished chords and 7th chords have a lot in common. And then there's another chord called B diminished 7th, which many of you have probably already played, but in case you haven't, it's 1, 2, 1, 2. That lady tied to the railroad track sound. We hear that all the time, that diminished 7th kind of sound. Well, that has 4 notes in it. That chord is made of B, D, F, and A flat. A flat is on top here, then comes D, then comes F, then comes A. 4 notes. Well, those same 4 notes could also be a D diminished chord. They could be an F diminished chord, and they could be an A flat diminished chord. Diminished 7th, that is. So let's check that out. I'm going to go over this real quick. Don't worry if I talk fast or if you need more clarification. I just want to breeze through this. I don't want to bog this down on diminished 7th chords, but I do get a lot of questions about this. So we said B, D, F, A flat is a B diminished chord. Well, a D diminished chord is D, F, A flat, C flat. Now you're saying, wait a minute, C flat, what's that? There's no such thing as C flat. You don't flat C. Well, occasionally you do. Very occasionally you do. And we'll talk about that in a while. This big, huge subject called enharmonic equivalence. We'll get into that. But if for just humor me for a minute, and let's call that note B, let's call it C flat. It's 1 fret lower than C. C flat. So if you do that, you get a D diminished chord. And then if you take those same notes and think of it starting on, say, F, F, A flat, C flat, there's that C flat again, and E double flat, then you get an F diminished chord. And you're saying to yourself, E double flat? You're making that up. There's no such thing as E double flat. Well, actually there is. Occasionally in music you have to double flat or double sharp a note. And I'll explain the rules governing that in a minute. There are some definite music theory rules about that. But if you took the note E, for instance this E, your A string 7th fret, and you went 1 fret lower than that, a half step lower than that, that's A flat, E flat, excuse me. But then if you go another half step below that, that's actually E double flat. but we know that commonly as D. We normally would just call that a D note, but there are some rare occasions, like when you're doing diminished seventh chords, where you would call that E double flat. We'll get into that later. I know some of you are scratching your head saying, E double flat, C flat, that guy's crazy. There's no such thing. He's making that up, but we'll check that out in a while, probably in part 2 or part 3 of this. All right, so anyway, that diminished seventh chord that we play at the first fret, 1 2 1 2, or for those of you that like pitch names, A flat D F A. It's a B diminished chord. Actually, I called that note A, excuse me, I meant to call that B. That's a B note. My mistake. But it's also a D diminished seventh. It's also an F diminished seventh, and it's also an A flat diminished seventh. This is 4 chords in one. That's 4 different diminished seventh chords. It's a weird music theory phenomenon, but that's just how it works out. So some chords have like 1 note in common. Some chords have 2 notes in common. Some chords have 3 notes in common. Diminished seventh chords have 4 notes in common. And so this is 4 chords in one. And that's all I'm going to say about that. We'll maybe go further into that in the future, but I think that's enough for us to understand for now, because I did want to move on.